and go through the whole book, because I think it's important right now. A lot of people I see are getting more and more dismissive of Zizek, and every time you hear somebody get dismissive of him, it's usually based on some article they read or some interview they saw him say something in they didn't like. And I have yet to meet anybody who is dismissive of him who have really taken the time to read his main books: Sublime Object of Ideology, Tearing with the Negative, Parallax View,
Less Than Nothing,
Ticklish Subject, and Less Than Nothing. Yeah, those are his 5 main books.
Oh, okay.
And seriously, I think Zizek is one of the most underread of the famous continental philosophers, because everybody thinks they already know what he's doing because they've watched YouTube videos of him or they've seen The Pervert's Guide to Cinema or Ideology. And what I'm finding is, just in this first chapter alone, there's a lot of orientation going on. But as I've told you before, I think the single most frustrating, difficult thing about reading Zizek is most of the time you can follow what he's saying. It's relatively clear. The problem is figuring out how to connect these dots. And I think that gets really difficult sometimes. This first chapter is about the symptom, but half the time he's not talking about the symptom. So you want to go, well, how the hell does canned laughter relate back to what he was talking about at the beginning with Marx and Freud and the symptom? And there is a kind of argumentative chain that I'm being able more and more to connect. But right now it's still fuzzy and I don't have it perfected. And so, like I say, yeah, I mean, all of this, I'm just taking, like, this is kind of a chance for us to get on a similar Lacanian page where we have a similar understanding of the terminology and have some idea of what Zizek's trying to do in this first chapter here. And then, like I say, down the road, if because we're going out of town, but in a month or two or something, if we want to go back and read the second chapter or something, figure something out with this, then we can. But
I also think it's this placement and like it worked really well. The fact that you and I and Sammy are going to meet Zizek like in a week, maybe hoping he's alive still. Is what you mean? Or
I thought it was like he was gonna maybe come to the conference depending on his health.
Yeah, health permitting, we'll be meeting him, and even if not, it's like still. So, but the bigger thing is that we're reading Hegel and Lacan this year, and he's one of the major popularizers of them, but also of kind of all of continental philosophy. And something he does in the preface of this text, and then also that he does in a few other books that I've seen elsewhere, is he'll make this argument that people's kind of everything people don't like about postmodernism or post-structuralism or whatever is because of Derrida, Habermas, Foucault. No one's contending with Althusser. No one's contending with Lacan. And to whatever degree they are contending with these people, like they
just made Lacan into a structuralist or something.
And yeah, they've lost all touch with Hegel as well.
Well, here, so one of the interesting things, let me find where in the text exactly so you can make a note of this.
I liked that on page XXX, at the very end of the introduction, right before moving into anything, he bullet points the goal of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically like salvage Lacan and also introduce people to like basic concepts, and then it's a return to Hegel.
Okay, so at the very beginning of chapter 5, which is called Which Subject of the Real, in the first section, there is no meta language. This is where he talks about how Lacan is not a post-structuralist. He doesn't belong in this camp. And he goes through and he talks about Derrida and Gadamer with hermeneutics and all this. And he emphasizes that for Lacan, there is something outside language. There is something, so to speak, outside the text. And it's the real. And again, it's this abstract term. I mean, if we put it in the clinical setting, what is outside of the analysand's discourse is all of this repressed, these repressed desires, signifiers. And so you would say, well, they're signifiers, so they're text. But the idea is that there are remnants of certain semiotic elements that are not present, that that structure the very subjectivity of the analysand, and yet never enter into that speech. And on top of it, there's objet petit a, and there's all of these, there's, which is jouissance, which is repressed in a sense. There's all this stuff that doesn't operate at the level of language. And so because of that, Zizek's going to say, look, Lacan thinks there's something outside language that is structuring our very discourse when we speak. And because of that, he's not reducible to the idea that, oh, reality is just language. Of course, language is important, but there is this external real that that most of the post-structuralists wouldn't go for. And so chapter 5 is where, if you want to read Zizek's take on that, you want to go to chapter 5. And so I guess, to get started, we kind of talked about it. Should we just kind of talk Lacan for a little bit and talk the terminology and see where we get?
Yeah, quick run over those dictionary terms would probably be useful, right?
Okay, let's look at that list again here. And like I say, these are just kind of bare minimum terms. There's a lot more we could add to this list, but all right, so let's talk jouissance for a second. So you'll hear this term. Zizek always translates the word as enjoyment, and he'll use it throughout this whole book. I agree with Levi Bryant. This isn't a good translation. It just doesn't, in English, enjoyment doesn't carry the connotative traces that we want it to carry. In French, jouissance carries this connotation of orgasm and sexual pleasure, sexual intensity. And we don't just get that from enjoyment. That's like a broader term for us. And yet at the same time, so here's the thing. Lacan essentially contrasts pleasure to jouissance. There's a distinction there. And this is one of the binary distinctions he makes that a lot of times is kind of elusive. He doesn't come right out and just go, there's pleasure and there's jouissance. But here's the idea. Pleasure, the way he's using this term, he's inheriting from Freud. And for Freud, there's the pleasure principle, reality principle, right? Well, for Lacan, the pleasure principle and the reality principle kind of form a unit that they in a sense work together. But what pleasure is for Freud and for Lacan is reaching a kind of tensionlessness in your body, in your subjectivity. It's calm. It's basically the state we're all in right now. At least I think we're all in, where we're kind of calm. We're able to mentally think about things, socially able to function properly, all of that kind of stuff. Well, as you know, it's funny to say this, but you're not going to be able to do that at the height of orgasm, right? I mean, when your body is filled with pleasure, when there's an intensification in the sensations of the body, you're not there functioning as a social subject, right? And it can go both ways. If there's an excess of enjoyment or jouissance, it kind of annihilates subjectivity. That's why the French called orgasm the little death, right? You die for a moment subjectively. The same thing for pain, right? I mean, you can't do your taxes if somebody's cutting your leg off. It doesn't work that way. And so whenever there's this intensification of sensation or pleasure or pain, your subjectivity recedes. And so for Lacan, when he talks about the pleasure principle and the reality principle, but usually he talks pleasure principle, what he's talking about is how in our day-to-day life we avoid jouissance. And again, think of jouissance as pleasure up to the point of pain. It's where pleasure becomes so intense that it becomes a burden or irritating. Sometimes it's traumatic, sometimes it's frightening, But at the very minimum, it's when pleasure becomes discomforting. And so if seeking pleasure is seeking a kind of tensionlessness in the body, an equilibrium in the body, jouissance is what pulls us towards a disequilibrium, a kind of chaos, a kind of subjective death. And this is precisely why Lacan's going to associate jouissance with the death drive. That jouissance is death in the sense that if we were in a constant state of orgasmic bliss, our subjectivity ceases to function. We die, in a sense. And so, in a sense, we're always chasing jouissance. That's what we want. But if we get it, we don't want it because it's subjective death. And this is why that quip from Oscar Wilde really kind of sums up Lacan. In life, there are only two tragedies: not getting what you want and getting what you want. And so jouissance is, again, it's contrast. And so I like to think of it as this: pleasure is tensionlessness in the body. Jouissance is the motion, the movement towards tension, excitement, bodily exhilaration. And so this is why you find time and time again the Lacanians are going to associate jouissance with objet petit a. And so there's a whole story here. So the idea is this, and this is where we get into Lacan's idea of the Oedipus complex. And Lacan, it's especially the early and middle Lacan, you can start to debate it when you get to the later Lacan, because he says Oedipus was Freud's dream and all this stuff. But for Lacan, he does hold to the Oedipus complex. He just rereads it in structuralist terms. So it's not, for him, the father doesn't have to be the literal father, the biological parent with a penis. It's the symbolic father. It's whatever fulfills the function of giving the law and placing limits on our pleasure or our jouissance, putting limits on our jouissance, saying, no, you can't have that now. No, you can't do this or that or whatever. And this no of the father or name of the father, right, is what makes us detached from our mother and the jouissance we have in the union with our mother as infants. And it detaches us, brings us into the social order of things. This is basically just the mechanism of socialization, right? But the idea is Lacan reads it in terms of what we have to sacrifice to enter socialization, to enter the symbolic order, is, in a sense, losing jouissance, putting limits on it, sacrificing it. It's the pound of flesh we pay to get into the symbolic order. Otherwise, you just are in this constant state of immediacy with jouissance, where you're trying to get jouissance from your mother or from whoever, and you never become a social functioning subject. But again, this results in a kind of traumatic loss. That this jouissance that we live in, I mean, if you try to do a phenomenology of it, you're a baby, you cry the second you have a need, it's met relatively quick. You're always being taken care of. You're either eating or shitting or being hugged. It's just being bathed in constant jouissance. You're always in a kind of intense, sensational bubble. And at some point, Lacan talks about how the name of the father, on one level, it's traumatic because it makes us give up this immediacy, this jouissance. On another level, it's salvific. It's like, get this mother the fuck away from me. Let me have some breathing room and be an individual. Like, I don't want to be attached to her forever. And so there's something salvific in it, but it also creates this trauma. It also, on the other side, creates this sense of loss. And the fact that this early period of our lives, we have all our needs met, we live in this constant state of jouissance. The idea is that as we grow up, we're always trying to get back to that. It was so simplistic. It was so simple. it had such a sense of completeness to it. Once we're socialized subjects and limits have been placed on us, we now are lacking subjects. We feel as though we lack, and in a sense we do lack. We lack the immediacy of jouissance we had as children. And so we spend the rest of our lives trying to get that, but it's, in a sense, structurally impossible for us to ever get it. And if we did get it, it would destroy us as subjects. And this remainder, this ghost of jouissance, right, that we have to give up, that's what objet petit a is. On the one hand, and Zizek says it in this chapter, it's a paradoxical object. And look, the French, Lacan's using the French terms. Object's a weird word because it doesn't weigh anything, right? I mean, it's the ghost of the jouissance you sacrificed in becoming socialized, to simplify it. And it's not an object in the standard sense of the word, but it always finds itself in objects. And this is why he'll call it the object cause of desire, not the object of desire, but the object cause of desire. And I'll go back to that in a second. But so the idea is that it's a paradoxical object. On the one hand, objet petit a is nothing but a lack. It's the lack in ourselves. It's what we lack subjectively. On the other hand, it's this kind of positive object because we do find it embodied in specific things, specific people. It's why we desire who we desire. It's why we pursue what we pursue. And so it does have a certain positive dimension to it, but it's certainly paradoxical in that sense. On the one hand, it's lack. On the other hand, it's like virtual plenitude. It's as if we're chasing something that's going to completely and utterly fulfill us subjectively. So is we on the same page with this so far? Any thoughts, Dave?
So Brian's P.
Okay.
I guess I'll just say that I think, okay, I want to clarify because it felt like there might have been a couple points there because you said jouissance is like here, pleasure is here. Pleasure is more like we're all the state we're all at where we can be functioning subjects within
Free of pain.
Free of pain, essentially. Jouissance is more like, oh, when it's really after something, when it's really after this object cause, right? And that object cause is that it's really like it's a structure of the psyche.
Yeah. And
different things go into that space, but in general, there's just like this structure.
Right.
It's
the structure of fantasy. And so this is where fantasy comes into it. I don't know if you could write it out for them. Are you familiar with his formula of fantasy, or are you, Sammy?
Yeah.
What is it?
Okay, so it's a barred S. It's an S with a line through it, and then it's a lozenge. It's the little four-sided diamond shape, and then it's the little A for objet petit a.
Oh,
so
yes.
Yeah, that one. Like the little
diamond there. Okay, yeah. Well, I forgot what that was again.
I'm bad at remembering formula, so I'm bad at remembering mathing.
So here's the thing. This is, you see Zizek use this time and time again. And he's going to say, this is our fundamental subjective structure. But when you go to Bruce Fink, for example, you're going to find that there's a bunch of these different math themes and these different formulas for, this is fundamental fantasy, but it's the fundamental fantasy for obsessional neuroses, right? It's not for perverts. It's not for even hysterics. They have different fundamental fantasies. And it's kind of funny that he uses this, but this is in Lacanian theory, this is basically, for the most part, the default setting of men. It's how our fundamental fantasy works, how our fundamental desire works. And the hysterics, which by default, for the most part, are women's subjective structure. Of course, Lacan is going to say some men are hysterics, some women are obsessionals, right? And that he leaves gender to be the very structure of desire, right? On some level. And so these are not fixed, there's no biological norms here. It's just these are different structures for fundamental fantasy. And they, as abstract as they seem, they have very different concrete, practical effects on how we live and how we relate to other people. But this one right here is the one Zizek's always using. And so the idea, and in some sense, you can use it to talk about everybody. The Bard subject is, on the one hand, the fact that when we enter into the symbolic order, what gets repressed, and he uses all these terms, the phallic signifier, the signifier of the mother's desire, all this shit. But in basic terms, what we repress is our connection and jouissance with our mother. That has to be repressed. That has to go away. And we have to give that up in order to enter the symbolic and start to be standalone, individual, functional subjects. And so that Bard subject is the idea that for us to have subjectivity, it's always rooted in a lack. It's always rooted in a sense, kind of incompleteness. We gave up some part of ourselves in order to be this type of subject that we are. And so this is the idea of the Bard subject. And what the Bard subject, what we desire, what we're always chasing in some way, shape, or form is that lost jouissance that we gave up, which is objet petit a. So jouissance is connected to objet petit a. In Seminar 17, Lacan's going to identify objet petit a with surplus jouissance. Zizek mentions that here in this chapter on some level. And so for me, the way I understand it, when you think jouissance, you think objet petit a and vice versa. When you think those two, you can think death drive. And when you think all that, you can think real. Those are all kind of closely associated with Lacan. Now, let me flesh out objet petit a little bit, because when you look at his famous I'm drawing a blank. The Borromean knot, his Venn diagram, right? You have the three circles, the real, the imaginary, the symbolic. They're all linked together. But in the very middle of them, at the one intersection, they all overlap. You have objet petit a. And I take it that the idea is this. On the one hand, objet petit a has to do with the imaginary, which is our sense of self, our ego, conscious sense of self. We always feel like there's something missing. We always feel like we're lacking something, and we strive for fullness. We strive for completeness. And so on that level of the ego, we're always trying to be fulfilled. We're always trying to be whole. And wholeness is this key category that's related to the imaginary / the ego. And so on one hand, our sense of always trying to gain a sense of completeness, fullness, completion in ourselves, that's ultimately rooted in objet petit a, where we lost something. Now, the ego, of course, for the most part, has no idea what it lost. It couldn't tell you at all. But what it lost, what it feels like it's missing, is the jouissance it gave up to enter the symbolic. Now, on the one hand, objet petit a is also the real, because it avoids symbolization. And what that means, as far as I understand it, is that in our day-to-day lives, we can never put our finger on it, what makes us desire what we desire. It's real. It's outside of our intelligibility. It's outside of our language. It's outside of our symbolic order. And in a sense, you could even say it's repressed, because the idea is, say you have a daydream, and this is something Zizek notes in this chapter that's very interesting. Think about if you have a dream, right? You usually don't have any problem waking up the next day, if you remember it, telling your friends your dream. You may do an interpretation on it for fun, nothing big. But your daydreams, your fantasies, you don't want to tell people those. There's a sense like, no, I'll talk to you about my dreams. I won't tell you about my fantasies. And the idea is that what our deepest fantasies, and you know, we get lost in the content of our fantasies. And even if we can get an idea of what the latent content is, what's behind the manifest content, for Zizek and Lacan, the real structure of fantasy is how we view objet petit a, how we're relating to objet petit a. And again, that lost sense of jouissance that we think we're going to get. And what you find is it usually takes on, this is why you find people have relationship patterns, right? So one person I know always ends up breaking up with the other, whoever they're with. It's this repetitious pattern, right? But he can't tell you why he does this. He doesn't know why. It just is driving him in his interpersonal relationships. And so this kind of unconscious structure has to do with objet petit a, and that's part of why it goes in the real. On the other hand, the reason that objet petit a belongs in the symbolic as well is there is a semiotic dimension to it. So think of it like this. So when you're a baby, you see your mother's traits, they make an impression on you. This is like what Freud calls the primary process. It's the process of the id. It's this idea that you get vast enjoyment from this other person. This other person has traits. Your memory lays down those traits and associates them with jouissance, right? So as you grow, especially you hit puberty, is it any wonder that most of us in some way, shape, or form end up dating our parents? And so, and again, maybe this kind of has some heteronormative aspect to it, but by and large, the average straight guy ends up dating women who are like his mom. I mean, everybody, this is kind of psychoanalysis 101. And the idea is because you get these fundamental, in this context, we could call them S1s, these fundamental signifiers or memory traces, and they lay down the coordinates of our libidinal economy, how we desire, what we want, what we fantasize about. And as we grow, there's a kind of chain that, gets built. So you go through puberty, you start dating. And so maybe you're attracted to this girl in middle school or high school because her hair is like your mom. So there's a trait there, right? So what's causing you to desire the whole person is this one particular trait. That's the cause of desire, right? Objet petit a. It's the trait, the S1, that causes you to desire the whole. And I've seen people say, oh, we shouldn't associate objet petit a with the Greek idea of agalma. Plato talks about agalma in the Symposium, and it's the idea, it's that treasure that's unspeakable in the other person that you desire, but you can never put your finger on. You don't know why you desire the other person, but they have something that causes you to desire them. And as far as from my reading, and I think Bruce Fink agrees with this too, I think you can associate objet petit a with agalma, that it's that indescribable it factor, right? That person just has it, right? And the idea is that, okay, so one trait or a few traits make you desire this person. Well, as you spend time with them and enjoy them and get jouissance from them, then there's a chance that one of their traits that hadn't previously been associated with it deeply in your libidinal economy, you get attached to that, and there's this kind of chain, right? So if you find yourself, like I like brown eyes, but your mom doesn't have brown eyes, well, maybe your mom had brown hair, the other girl you end up dating in high school has brown hair, but she had brown eyes, and it's this whole chain of traits. And this is why Zizek and Lacan, they're going to talk about desire as this very kind of violent thing, right? Because you're just using the person for these traits they have. And these traits aren't their individuality. Other people have brown eyes. Other people have brown hair. It's this, what you're really pursuing sexually is this template, this framework of features. And that's what causes you to desire the specific person.
So it's metonymy and metaphor, right? That's
Yep, exactly.
And then what? So this, I mean, what you were just describing is totally metonymy. It sounds like.
Yeah. No, and he uses those terms to describe how desire moves from one thing to another. They move in this substitutive movement. Like, okay, and this is the thing. If you want to talk like Levinas, you can never substitute another person for another, but you can substitute traits, right? And so this is why desire, sexuality is this kind of extreme violence where you're just using this other person for these traits they have. Ultimately, you can, you find somebody who better embodies those traits, has those traits to a fuller degree, then you're like, all right, bye, I'll go with the next one. And this is why there's this sharp contrast for Zizek between desire / sexuality and love. Love is the embrace. It's like a Levinasian embrace of the other. You're not just reducing them to traits, right? It's their thisness that you fall in love with. And so I think there's some overlap with Levinas and Lacan there.
This difference between desire, sex, and love. What is desire on this jouissance to pleasure binary?
So, basically, if we're just pursuing sexual pleasure, right, trying to get laid, that's caught up with desire and not love. So sexuality and desire go on the same side over against love.
But because, and desire doesn't have to function with sexuality, though. It can function in other ways, like you desire certain emotional traits or certain patterns of the way you're treated or the way that they act, So it doesn't necessarily be sexual, but they're on the same side.
Right. So here's the thing. Those traits, I just use the physical characteristics because it's kind of the basic default way of thinking about it, right? But half the time, the traits that are associated that make you desire somebody, they're behavioral tics. They behave like your mom behaved or your dad behaved. They make you feel a certain way that your parents did or a former lover did. Again, it's not the good thing with Lacan. It's not just reducible to your parents. I mean, other significant others in your life have an impact on your desire, your fantasy. It keeps developing through metaphor metonymy. So I just use the parents because, they do have a kind of fundamental impact on us. And it's easy to see that, right? But I don't think that, if you desire somebody with brown eyes, it always goes back to your parents. No, not necessarily. It could be somebody else that you had, jouissance with that, laid that down as a fundamental core of your desire, coordinate of your desire.
So I guess I think that I'm on the right track here, but I wanted to clarify. I used to get this sort of two aspects of trauma mixed up. The first one, but it seems like there's a fundamental trauma, especially with this particular structure, right? That's sort of the default quote unquote structure of fantasy, right? There's the trauma of separation,
yep.
That imposed by the law of the father, okay? And so I think I used to struggle with Lacan because I was like, well, does it always have to be traumatic? Because I just didn't want to admit, every childhood has to have trauma. And now I'm starting to see, though, that there's different forms of trauma. Like this is sort of the fundamental, if you're attached to your mom and have jouissance, well, there's a point of individuation. Yeah. But because there's that doesn't necessarily mean all trauma is equivalent, right? And there's different so for example, if you don't end up attaching, there's babies who die because they don't get jouissance, right? When they're in a developmental stage where they really need to have a sort of life drive, or
no, true. Babies who don't experience that, they did those studies I remember hearing about in Russian orphanages where the kids never get touched, the kids die.
Yeah.
Right?
They would feed them. They would feed them.
They'd feed them and do all the necessary things, but they would never give them they would never cuddle them or they'd be left to cry for a long time before they got fed, and they didn't die of starvation or anything. It was just from lack of attention. But so I guess what I wanted to say is so there's the fundamental sort of trauma of separation, but then there's other forms of trauma that could be related to abuse or neglect or whatever, and those can be dealt with in a different way, and they might structure your subjectivity in a different way.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that's absolutely right. From what I've read, trauma is more of a technical term. So it's not I walked into a bar and the second I got in there, I saw my friend get their head blown off. It's not like these horrific, like the worst things that you could imagine, like these shocks that you can't process, right? So sometimes, Lacan will talk about them as the missed encounter, right? So it can be something really subtle that bothers you that you can't cope with. It's anything like that gets stuck in your psychical system that never gets processed properly. And the idea is a lot of the stuff, this is why it's fun to read Lacanian case studies. And there's a good book that I can recommend. I've read a couple of these, and I think they're really helpful. So let me give you an example. This is a kind of trauma. I don't remember exactly where I read this, but I read it somewhere. So guy goes in for psychoanalysis, and he spends a lot of time. And the one of the main things you're going to do as a psychoanalyst is wait to hear the things that your patient, the analysand, always repeats. Wherever they repeat, you want to focus tension. You want to focus in on that, right? At the same time, the places that they go out of their way to never discuss, you also want to focus on those. And so as a psychoanalyst, what you end up doing, you're kind of like cartographer. You're mapping the discourse of this other person. And you're looking for the places that are always repeated. You look for the places that are always avoided. And those are very telling points. And so in this one case that I read about, this guy just always kept saying, yeah, but I'm a loser. I'm just a loser. And the psychoanalyst goes, okay, there's something going on here that with loser. Well, as a Lacanian, you don't sit there and go, how does he feel? Why does he feel this way about himself? Or, what's the deep, deep, profound meaning behind him feeling like a loser? You simply focus on the word loser. What is it about this specific signifier that shapes this guy's subjectivity? And so by always bringing the conversation back to, yes, but you say that you feel like a loser, always highlighting that, always highlighting whenever the person uses the word lose, over time, what you end up doing is you loosen up its repression. And by focusing on it, you can make a space where the association or whatever is going to come through from out of the unconscious, and something's going to enter consciousness for the first time since it's been repressed. And there's going to be a certain relief that the reason that we are so neurotic is because there's all this stuff, which the actual content of it, I'll get to in a second. There's all this stuff in the unconscious, and the unconscious is like this eternal sphere. It never works through. And so when there's a slip of the tongue, when there's a symptom, when it's actually trying to make its way, dreams, for example, the unconscious is trying to get something out that would relieve unconscious tension, that would free up the unconscious. And it tries to do this in the form of dreams, slips of the tongue, symptoms, etc. And so what you find when you approach this from a Lacanian perspective, what's in the unconscious are signifiers, just pieces of words. It's like semiotic trash. And what makes Lacan so different than someone like Jung is what you find out is none of this shit is deep. There's no deep meaning to it. And in fact, it's quite deflating, because when you realize that your whole life has been structured, shaped by stupid misunderstandings of words, or words you didn't process, or words you misheard, right? You realize how fucking contingent your whole existence has been. There's no deep, profound meaning to it. It's stupid shit your parents said and you misunderstood, and it shaped your whole life, right? So to go back to the example, this guy, his whole life feels like he's a loser. It affects him in his personal relationships. It affects him in his job. Well, eventually it comes out and he goes, I just thought of something that I hadn't thought about. He's like, it's a childhood memory. And analyst is like, can you describe it? He goes, I was playing outside by the curb and I fell and I knocked my 2 front teeth out. And my mom ran over to me and he was like, I remember her looking at me with just so mad, and she grabbed me up by my arm and said, "Did you just lose your teeth?" And the idea is that was so traumatic for him as a kid. He repressed it because of this utter disappointment he caused his mother. And the word lose got repressed into the unconscious. And then from there on, it takes on whatever kind of associations it does. It drifts. And he ends up thinking he's a loser because this word lose got stuck in his unconscious.
So the word kind of covers over the trauma in a sense, like it's a way of displacing that feeling or like keeping it under lock.
You know what? For Lacan, it's the word itself that for him, okay, for him, there's not really repressed. And this is Freudian. Freud said the same thing. Feelings never get repressed. And this is where we want to go, well, of course they are. We talk about it. And even I find myself slipping up sometimes because it's just how we generally think of it. But if we want to get really technical, for Lacan, and he would say for Freud, based on his reading of Freud, the only things that exist in the unconscious are signifiers. Now, what happens with feelings? So, right, this kid has this traumatic feeling. For Lacan and for Freud, the feeling doesn't get repressed. What happens is it drifts around your subjectivity and you project it onto other people. But you're aware of it. And he would even describe how the feeling was always with him on some conscious level, right? It's not repressed out of sight. He's always living with that feeling, but he doesn't know why he has it, what it's directed towards, and it drifts and it ends up affecting his relationships with other people. He projects it onto them. And so it still resides on some level at the conscious level. But what gets repressed is the signifiers. And you could go, well, this sounds really arbitrary. It just sounds like they're pulling this shit out of their ass. But for Freud and Lacan, you got to realize they had years and years and years of clinical experience. And what they would find is that their analysons were very familiar with these kind of feelings that were roaming feelings that just kind of drifted around. And they always felt that way. They were always in the shadow of these feelings. So they're not unconscious because these guys, the patients are aware of them in some way. What they're not aware of are the signifiers. And this is why for Lacan, what becomes so deflating is despite our first person experience, the very structure of our subjectivity has to do with stupid words. Okay, so she said lose and he couldn't process it and he felt like he let her down or whatever. So he couldn't deal with it, put it out of sight. And then this word just hovers in the unconscious doing whatever it does. It's always with him, but totally out of sight, totally unaware of it. And it eats away at him until that word can come through and he puts it in an associational context to understand its significance. And so, of course, in some sense, you could say it's about giving the unconscious signifiers meaning. But the reason that Lacan and Zizek want to say there is no meaning there, it's just there's no grand meaning. This is some stupid, pointless, contingent event that it's not profound. It's stupid. And what they would find time and time again is the shit that was eating away at their patients were just words that they misunderstood from childhood or half of a word or something. There's another case study where it was like a suffix was what was driving this girl crazy, and it kept reappearing, and she always had to use this suffix in her conscious discourse. And so this is where it gets really weird is, what we're all fucked up about is signifiers. But what you find is that the real blueprint or fingerprint of our individual subjectivities is just a network of these signifiers in the unconscious. And so here's why it's deflating. This is why Lacanian psychoanalysis ends up with, Zizek always talks about it, and Lacan did, subjective destitution. There's like an existential crisis you have to go through when you do Lacanian psychoanalysis, because what you find is this. At your subjective core, the things that make you, your subjective fingerprint, so to speak, is just parts of language. Well, language is the big other, Dossmann, so to speak. So at your most intimate core, you're the other. And so the idea is there is no real intimate core to you. That's your thisness. Your thisness is just a cluster or constellation or configuration of semiotic scraps,
So,
parts of words, etc.
so I guess what's confusing to me is still, again, like trying to connect it to, because it seems like this, for someone who's had like a pretty standard life experience, that would make sense. But like, what about people who have had like, you know, like really terrible things said to them, that it's not something you can't even, you know, like are there signifiers that actually do have a sort of like, I don't want to say grand meaning, but they're not just stupid or like silly or inconsequential? Is Lacan sort of saying those things don't actually structure your psyche? It's the stupid ones that do.
No, what I think he means is just this. So, in some sense, of course, if your parent says something horrible to you, it is huge as a child. But even when you grow up, in a sense, who is this stupid person that said that? I mean, there's something like this. This is just a dumb person who their opinion doesn't matter. I mean, who gives a fuck what they say? You know, they're an idiot like the rest of us. And so, yeah, for the child person, you know, the kid experiences that as deeply meaning. But on some level, it's just some stupid idiot who said something to you. And so what you find is your whole life has still been shaped, morphed, and configured around what some just specific dumbass, or even if they're evil, some total evil piece of shit said to you. What you find is it's still at your subjective core. It's still these words that came from the other, from language itself. And I mean, okay, it was this person who conveyed the words, but those words were operative in language. And so it's this kind of disheartening moment where you realize that your individuality, what you feel like is your most intimate, comes from the big other, comes from language. And it's just a contingent configuration of these signifiers. And and here's the thing, I don't know Lacan good enough to say this, but I think he would say, yeah, of course, certain traumas can be far more intense. I don't think he's just going to say that they're flat. I mean, certain things do affect different people in different ways more intensely in certain cases. So I think he would totally agree to that. I think he would say, yeah, all traumas are not equal at all. But what you find is trauma in some way, shape, or form is part of all of us.
So I took the critical theory class 2 summers ago with Gaetan Besutaker, and something that he does with Lacan as a Lacanian. A lot of what you're saying does sound similar, but I think maybe what Sam is getting at is the idea is like the subject is like this space within a walled city. Is kind of the analogy used. You've got a bunch of signifiers in there for what the subject is.
Yeah.
But those are on signifying chains. Binary, like there's oppositions of like what that is not, right, on those chains. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm a man and I'm straight, or and I'm middle class, well then each one of those chains goes to something that I'm not, and those things get repressed in certain ways, right? And then there's also like so you're in a culture where everyone's like, yeah, well, if you were gay, that'd be fucked up. And then someone's like, oh, you're a faggot. And then you're like, shit, and like it becomes like this traumatic experience. You're being bullied now. Now you have to find some way of like coming to terms with these signifiers that have become charged in these chains, right? And so
that's a good word, charged. That's a good word.
Is what?
I think the word charged is good. And because charge, I mean, things can have a greater intensity, right? I mean, there's different intensities for the charge, and you live in a society that is greatly homophobic, that's going to have a much more harsher charge or impact on you subjectively if somebody hurls that at you. And so it's so complex, and that's what you find with Lacan. He's always drawing that out, is how overcomplicated we are, or overdetermined we are by language, and these signifiers affect these signifiers, and it affects us at the level of our identifications. And so we are just this vastly complex network of semiotic configurations, right? Conscious and unconscious. Hold on 1 second. I'm losing the charge here, so I'm gonna have to go hook this up. Let me get my battery charger.
Losing the charge.
I know. I was like,
oh, good word.
One thing that I think I'd add, and I'd just like to say that I've only taken an AP psych course, so think of that what you will, was in no way Lacanian, and basically the only Freud we learned was so they could tell us never to use Freud.
Right.
But
how they do it. Sounds about right.
Freud and Lacan are threatening to.
Yeah.
Anyways.
It was very analytical. It was you have this way of diagnosing everything, blah blah blah. But it also I think Stirner gives us a good word for this, spooks in society. And so these are basic things that are just going to be instilled in us through just, general learning. When we're in the mirror stage with our parents, we're going to see when we're trying to identify ourselves in our parents and in the people around us, we're going to start recognizing these spooks and claiming them as our own because we're going to need them. So, things like homophobia in a homophobic society. But
if I'm like my parents, that means I can't be this, or this thing is like a.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, it also affects how you're going to react to trauma. So, someone who grows up in this relationship of trauma might be more desensitized to very traumatic injuries. So, if they are very heavily abused as a child, then in their basic mirror stages, ingrained as this kind of
truth about the world or something.
Yeah, and a bit of harshness, a bit of jadedness, wherein, things like abuse are more normal and therefore less traumatic. But then you got a middle-class white guy who once dropped an ice cream cone as a kid, but because he had lived in this life of pure jouissance, that is literally what determines his ruthless business mogul phase 30 years later, because he's literally just terrified of ever dropping something again or ever having something stolen from him again.
You just described me.
Or he's afraid of the word drop. Or the word drop.
Pissed in their cornflakes, right?
Do you know that actually happened to me? My little brother pissed in my cereal. My mom's giving him a bath on the table, and he's
just shot over this.
Directly.
One of those fancy modern water sculpture things.
No, and the funniest thing is I didn't want to finish it. I was like, these Cheerios are soggy. My mom was like, it's food, eat it. And then it was just the grace of God descended into my bowl, And I was like, do I have
God
to
is
eat
this?
Yeah.
So, okay, Brian, I wanted to ask you though, does this help at all with these you see the kind of connection they have, or is it still fuzzy, or?
No, this is really helpful. I didn't have a ton of time to read this chapter, but no, this is incredibly helpful, and it's making me really excited for when we get to the Lacan. And there are two terms that I was hoping you might be able to break down a little more. I don't know if they're Zizek's explicitly, or if they go back to Lacan, but fetish and pervert, how they're more specifically. Because those are central.
Was this the pervert?
Differently.
Is this you said that this is this?
That's the fundamental fantasy of the obsessional neurotic.
Obsessional neurotic.
Okay, and that's just your typical white dude.
Yeah.
And then
a typical dude in general. I mean, just the average guy walking around is usually an obsessional neurotic. The average girl is a hysteric.
We got the hysteric.
How is the structure of the hysteric different? I mean, I guess we could go to Brian's terms.
Well, yeah, because the perverse plays into the hysteric.
There's hysteric, there's neurotic, and that's pretty much it, right?
No, there's a psychotic too. So here's what you've got. There's three clinical. He calls these the clinical structures. There's neurosis, which under neurosis you have the obsessional and the hysteric. So they're both neurotics. Then you have the pervert structure, and then you have the psychotic structure.
That's four.
Wait, hold on.
Right, but the obsessional and the hysteric are both neurotics. So they're species The neurosis is the genus.
I see.
And then, so, okay.
Neurosis, perversion, and psychosis. Those are the three.
Cool.
So okay, so here's where the problem, it gets a little fuzzy for me, is I have not spent a lot of time working through the structures. Now, I've read what Bruce Fink says, and he helped me to some degree. I've always found that these three structures are part of the hardest aspect of Lacanian theory for me to get a grasp on, and I think it's precisely because these are categories you really use in the clinical setting, because this is why Lacan would hate the DSM-5, right? He hates, for Lacan, if you want to get more specific, you have to get more abstract. And this is why he would hate these instruments like the DSM-5, because they're so specific, he thinks they really can't help at all. The only way to get some kind of thread to be able to help a person is to go more abstract. And so you could say with Lacan, abstraction is concretation, right? It's we get concrete through getting more abstract. And so despite all of the various differences with individual people, if you can narrow down their fundamental fantasy or their subjective structure to one of these math themes, one of these formulas for fundamental fantasy, then you have a lot more to go on, right? And for Lacan, he thinks you're actually going to be able to help this single individual in front of you far more with an abstract structure like this than trying to just look at their symptoms and fit them into some diagnosis in the DSM-5, right? Because these go to their whole, the very structure of their whole subjectivity. So,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
So is that kind of where Foucault gets his whole notion of doctors and their reduction of patients to symptoms instead of actually just treating them as individuals?
You know, I'm not sure. I mean, I know that Foucault was he was aware of Lacan and was familiar with him. I think Foucault had more of an antagonism with psychoanalysis. He's more in that camp, I think, with Deleuze and Guattari, where they see psychoanalysis as this kind of bourgeois power discourse. And so, but with that being said, I'm sure Lacan had some positive influence on Foucault, but I'm not sure exactly what.
Well, Lacan and Foucault were both part of the anti-psychiatry movement, just in different ways, but they both had a lot of the same problems with the mainstream orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
For exactly what the kind of thing that you're pointing out, totalization, or etc.
Well, so think about it like this.
These structures you're talking about, like we've stayed very abstract about them, and so like to give us a couple of examples about perversion, could we first just for the neurotic? What's essential about the neurotic, and then does that break down into basically projecting all your shit onto others, and then or internalizing everything?
See, but here's where it gets tricky.
The difference there, or something like that.
This is where it gets tricky, because everything I've read on these structures never gives me the answers I want, and so it's like I don't know what to say half the time when this gets brought up, because I've yet to find anything that I feel really brings this home for me. These are the parts of Lacanian theory I'm still unclear on. I'll try to give you an example. So, all right, let's just talk about neurosis. Well, on some level, the idea of a fully healthy subjectivity is not going to be something that's possible, according to Lacan. We're all fucked up in one way or the other. Most of us are fucked up being neurotics. And so that means that we're going to have shit in our unconscious that takes the form of dreams and symptoms, all these unresolved issues. And yes, I can't tell you exactly how it would work, but the obsessional is going to deal with them one way, the hysteric's going to deal with them another, the pervert's a whole nother story, and the psychotic's another story. But take this fundamental fantasy, right, though, of what you already laid out. Barred subject, diamond-shaped or lozenge, objet petit a. Right now, one thing I should say, the lozenge, it's 4 signs in one. It's a disjunction, conjunction, greater than, less than.
Wow.
That's why he used that. He wanted the 4. Those are the 4 different ways. So even people who have this same structure, this obsessional, neurotic, fundamental fantasy, the way they have it, they can have it in 4 different ways, right? Actually, let me see if I can. I have a note here that probably is pretty helpful here.
You can also screen share if you have like images.
Okay. I might just copy and paste it here.
It's disjunction, conjunction, greater than, lesser than, which makes sense, right? That's really cool.
So give me 1 second to find this.
Without thinking the word change, or no, possibility, right? Changes a triangle, but yeah, possibility. So that's cool because then it's actually like, I don't know, greater than, lesser than. You remember that because this is the actual symbols put together.
Oh my god.
All right, so here we go. Let's see here. I'll start a bit early. These are from my notes on seminar 17. So let's start. Okay. When Lacan discussed fantasy, he always symbolized its structure with the following formula. Barred est, diamond shape A, which is, again, objet petit a. Fantasy is the after effect of S1 insofar as the split subject and the Lacanian object are the products of the signifier. So the idea is that what the signifier does, and again, we always say the signifier. It's like how the continental tradition uses the word other, the other. It doesn't mean this singular signifier, this singular other. It can mean a bunch of others, a bunch of signifiers. So what language does is it produces us as a subject that lacks. It puts limits on our jouissance, limits on our enjoyment, and in so doing, it creates this virtual object, the ghost of that jouissance we gave up. So that's the split. Is we're split because now we lack something. We never know exactly what it is, but what we find out is it's this jouissance, right? So okay, the diamond shape is meant to condense 4 signs: 1, conjunction; 2, disjunction; 3, greater than; 4, less than. For Lacan, following Freud, after the loss of the first object or objects, those basically the mother or the traits of the primary caregiver, it could be a biological male. So after the loss of the first objects, the drives are forever structured in terms of fantasy. The fundamental fantasy involves the specific arrangements or imaginary dynamics through which one hopes to recapture the first object. That is, the unique ways the subject phantasmatically stages the retainment of lost jouissance. The fundamental fantasy of the drives is a mise-en-scene, right? It's like this stage setting. So, okay, let me keep going here because I return to this. All right, so again, the diamond shape is a condensation of the symbols for conjunction, disjunction, greater than, less than. For Lacan, all speaking subjects ultimately have at their unconscious basis a fundamental fantasy or phantasmatic structure. This is like one of Kant's transcendental schematisms. It is a skeletal outline of how the subject ultimately structures its desires or desiring subjectivity in relation to the object cause of its desire. That trait that you think is going to give you the lost jouissance you're missing. One's fundamental fantasy can involve fantasies of fusion, synthesis, or merging, which would be conjunction. It can involve repudiation, rejection, distancing. That would be disjunction. It can involve superiority, domination, sadism. That would be greater than. Or it can involve submission, dependency, or masochism, less than. Each subject has a fundamental fantasy of one of these four sorts, and it is what forms the illusory underside of our sense of mastery, right? So we think we have a clear idea of who we are, what we want, what we desire, when in fact, our most fundamental desire could be something that's totally at odds at what we consciously desire, right? And it's these structures. This is what we mean by structure. So if you think what's going to give you your lost jouissance, what's going to give you total satisfaction is dominating, then you're going to be a certain type of person. If you think it's going to be in rejecting other people, that gets you a different type. If it's being dependent on other people. And so these are examples of how this specific fundamental structure plays itself out in very concrete ways.
So just to summarize again, because there's a lot of words.
Yeah.
The greater than is the sort of domination, control, mastery, whatever.
Would it help if I reread that part again?
Yeah, just real quick, because I got lesser than and greater than signs, but I didn't get the other sides.
Okay. So what we have, so when you think conjunction, think fantasies of fusion, synthesis, merger, right? So you could say like a mystic has this desire to merge with God, right? That could be a mystic fundamental fantasy. So that would be conjunction, coming together in some way, unification.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Then with disjunction, it could be repudiation, rejection, distancing, separating yourself. So in some sense, it could be somebody who's always trying to make friends, but the second they make friends, they distance themselves from those people.
Or like your friend with his relationship patterns.
Right, exactly. And somehow the idea is that they're getting off by following these patterns, that they repeat them. And here's the thing, here's the catch. It's jouissance. A lot of the times these cause them a great deal of suffering. They get a lot of pain and they're very frustrated. Why do I keep doing this? Why do I date guys that treat me like shit? Why do I date women who cheat on me? Blah, 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 blah. They always put themselves in these scenarios, but this type of discomfort or pain, it's associated with pleasure on some level. That's what makes it jouissance. And so these fantasies take people in very weird places that they have a tendency to repeat over and over again. But okay, so disjunction again, separation, repudiation, rejection, distancing. With greater than, it's superiority, domination, sadism. And again, you think about it, it doesn't have to just be like fascistic, authoritarian type of stuff. It can be maybe you want to be greater in the sense of being a great artist, right? That you're over and above people because you have a greater talent or you're smarter than they are. It doesn't have to just be the standard kind of authoritarianism that we think of.
Versus there's someone who would get jouissance from being lesser than, or from being overly humble, or from like talking shit themselves.
Exactly. So, and then the last one is less than, which is submission, dependency. You could say being humble, right? Humbleness could be part of this. Masochism, right? So this is why Lacan liked these fundamental structures, these mathemes, because despite how abstract they are and how meaningless they seem, they cover so much ground that they really help you get a grip on, okay, this person is an obsessional neurotic and the main structure is greater than, right? So as a trained analyst, you'd have ways of dealing with this. And again, this is part of the problem is I approach Lacan far more like a philosopher does. So I'm interested in what's the ontology of the subject, all of this. And to get really trained in how to apply these in the clinical setting, you know, I'm not in a position to help there. I would love to go train and be a psychoanalyst, but, you know, I don't know exactly how analysts train other analysts to cope with these different structures in the clinical setting, right?
Well, you have to undergo analysis yourself for a long time.
Right, exactly. So, but here's the thing, and I we haven't made it explicit yet. This is what's so hard about reading Zizek. He presupposes all this shit. And I mean, we've just scratched the surface here, right? There's so much that he has internalized from Lacan that it makes it very difficult to follow him sometimes. But what he's doing, and we are in a position, he's going to take stuff like objet petit a, and he's going to say, all right, so objet petit a is this thing that we're always chasing. And yeah, it's highly individualistic, but how do political movements take that and manipulate it for their own ends, right? How does ideology appeal to our sense of wanting jouissance? How does it, in a sense, also put jouissance at a distance? I guess one thing that I think I have to emphasize while I'm thinking about it, here's what we want to refrain from doing is, oh, jouissance is a good thing. We want jouissance, right? No. Lacan, in his famous seminar on anxiety, he has a theory of anxiety that flies in the face of the philosophical tradition. Both Kierkegaard and Heidegger arguably have the two most famous theories of anxiety. And what they both have in common is both Kierkegaard and Heidegger would say anxiety is unique among moods because it doesn't have a definite object. Fear has a definite object. I fear getting cancer, or I fear poverty, right? I fear determinate specific things. But anxiety doesn't seem to have an object, right? It's directed at, for Kierkegaard, it's directed at freedom, which is not a determinate object in the world. It's something different. And for Heidegger, it's like worldhood as such. It's being in the world as such. But these are not determinate, definite things. Lacan says they're both wrong. Anxiety does have an object, and its object is objet petit a. When we get too close to actually getting what we think we want, we get anxious, we get scared, we don't actually want it. Because getting that lost jouissance back, getting the object cause of our desire, would make us cease to be desiring subjects. Well, we don't want that either. We think we want that as we walk around and we're not complete, but the second we ever move towards completion, we actually move away from it. We go back into the mode of desire. We go back into the pleasure principle. Like, no, don't move towards being filled with tension. Move in the direction of tensionlessness. And so it's always this back and forth. When we don't have jouissance, we want it. When we're too close to it or we get it, we don't want that either. We want to move the other direction. This is why Lacan lends himself to pessimism, right? I mean, it paints a kind of tragic picture of what it is to be human. But there's a tendency to think, oh, jouissance is this good thing that we're always chasing, and if we got it, we'd be happy. No, we'd be destroyed. And you see this in very concrete situations. People who go too far down the path of jouissance are like drug addicts, people who truly have deep obsessions that ruin their lives, right? They get too fixated on jouissance, and it destabilizes their life, throws it into chaos, and it's this really violent force. And so, pleasure doesn't satisfy, but neither does jouissance. So we're stuck between them. And yet at the same time, like I say, here's the good way to think about objet petit a and jouissance if we want to talk like this, when they're functioning properly, is when they're like the donkey's carrot, right? The donkey's carrot that lures the donkey to keep moving in a certain direction, but he's never going to actually get it. And that's, in a sense, the best type of relationship is moving towards objet petit a, but it remains at a distance and it doesn't work its way actually into your life, and you're suffocated by this violent upswell of jouissance.
It's really interesting interpreting. So there's a study done with rats and cocaine. I think it was cocaine. Where rats that were socially connected and, had relationships with other rats instead of being isolated, would actually ignore cocaine. Like they try it, but they wouldn't get attached to it, and they would ignore it. And then rats who are isolated and suffering in like a social way, because like all animals are social. It's bullshit when people are like, yeah, animals aren't social. they would could develop an addiction to the cocaine where they would be like desperate for it. They'd like kill other rats for it, you know, like or something like that. So they use this study to publish these interpretations of it, you know, that are like, oh, well, this gives us a new way of understanding addiction because addiction isn't about the substance, it's about like the sense of social connection you have, and if you're unsatisfied and miserable, of course you're going to attach to something that gives you pleasure or excitement or whatever, which makes sense on the surface, but then applying this structure to it, it's like pleasure. I was reading an article from Lacan online the other day I was telling you about. It was messing up my head about jouissance. Pleasure acts as a limit on jouissance, right?
That's the pleasure principle.
The sort of satisfactions of being in social relation to others and like having most of your needs met, including your social needs, demotivates you to seek jouissance in a sense, because there's like there's less of a drive towards that sort of like intense pleasure when you're in a good space, you know, when you're involved in like a pleasurable scenario.
And that's the thing. Don't think like pleasure. I don't want it to be like, oh, pleasure's bad. It's not. It's just, in a sense, it's like this back and forth. I mean, of course, you have a calm, good conversation with people. You can find real enjoyment in that. And so it's almost as if like there needs to be some other kind of category above pleasure and jouissance, right?
Actually, Elizabeth Graz, she's a sort of difference feminist philosopher. She uses Lacan and then connects him to Merleau-Ponty and the idea of the body and does all this stuff. And she's like, she calls it, I think, kind of just to stay, I don't know. Because like Lacan has some reputation of being somewhat, I guess, misogynistic with some people or something like that. So she calls it lesbian desire. But what she means is like the ability to be satisfied by it, or to put limit, like to merge that sort of idea of pleasure and jouissance into like there's a cap on your enjoyment, right? There's an ability to stop once or to like enjoy surface pleasures instead of these deep ones that take you over and lead to the sort of I guess death or overwhelming sensation.
Well, think about it like this. I think we've all had an experience or two like this. So take alcohol. Alcohol can be used for both. So you've had a shitty day, you're pissed off, you're frustrated, you go, I need a couple drinks. And those couple drinks actually calm you down, they relieve the tension, you feel less burdened. That's a movement towards pleasure, right? But if you keep going with it and you're like, fuck it, I can't, I don't want to deal with anything, then you push past pleasure and you actually go into the past the limit towards jouissance, where you get totally drunk, you're filled with excitement and enjoyment, or some people get really angry or whatever, but they want to push it into this very intense experience. And what you find is when you get that drunk, especially blackout drunk, well, your whole subjectivity goes away. And so you can take one substance, but it can be used for both. One, you have a few drinks, it helps you move towards tensionlessness and you're back into pleasure. You want to take it farther, then you go down the road of jouissance and you black out and you don't remember what happened, and it's a kind of death drive, right?
Yeah, it seems like harder drugs are the harder the drug is, the easier it is to get pulled into that like jouissance state by it. You're
exactly.
For subjectivity to dissolve in your pursuit of it.
So
I would just say, if you're interested in this, there was a great collection of essays. I've read part of it, but I think it's called Lacan and Addiction. And some group of psychoanalysts did a good study of this. And I think it really helps to give these concrete examples of, like, let's take this concept of jouissance and how addicts are pursuing it and study their case-by-case stories.
Cool. So I think we got like 40 minutes left. It's probably not. It's probably so. It's a way to move from. So we've talked a lot about pleasure and jouissance, and I think that you've done a great job of unpacking the basic formula that you're just going to be relying on.
Let me say one thing before we move on, because I know you wanted this and I was thinking about it. Let me give you just a kind of basic idea. So you take that structure of fantasy you have there, Bard S, in relation to objet petit a. If it's the case that most men are structured like that way, what you're going to get is this. I am a subject. I am a subjectivity. And out there is this thing that's going to make me happy. I'm going to pursue it. And once I attain this object, this thing, then I will feel good. I will have achieved. I will have conquered, right? And the person starts from the position of, I am a subject. I am a human being, right? And you're trying to accomplish something. This is a very kind of male idea, right? This is one of the criticisms that even Heidegger gets with the analysis of Dasein, where it's overly male. It's this idea of I, as a subject or Dasein, have a project and I'm going to accomplish it. It's something I care about and I'm going to fulfill it, and look what I have done, right? And so you as a subject are going to take pleasure in the fact that you accomplish what you sought to get. And so this could be with men. It's the idea of having a career or being successful, having money, right? It's a very kind of active structural fantasy. So in the case of hysterics, on the other hand, and it's very, in a sense, yes, of course, on some level, this male fantasy is going to involve other people, what other people desire. And yes, the desire is always the desire of the other, and that means a lot. But the other is always a referent in what you desire. It's not like you're just an absolute atom. But with men and with this structural fantasy, there's less an emphasis on the other. It's there, but it's more of me and what I want to accomplish. And you just kind of blind yourself to the fact that the other is structuring it. I look at this fantasy almost like a libertarian type of fantasy. It's me. I can conquer. I can do all. I'm going to get that which I want that makes me happy, right? Well, if you go to the hysteric fantasy, and if I'm remembering it correctly, the hysteric fantasy is little a, lozenge, big A, bard. It's a bard, big A. So little a, diamond shaped, capital A with a bar through it.
Say it one more time.
So it's object. It's the little a,
yep.
And then a bard, big A.
Yes. And so what you have here is objet petit a in relation to the other. The A is in French is autre. If I butcher French, but autre, A-U-T-R-E. And so yes, for Lacan, there is no big other in the sense there is no full symbolic network that can answer everything that's totally consistent with itself, and that's why it's barred. The big other, and even the big other as embodied in little others, just like there's me, but there's the Dossmann side of me that I'm generic like everybody else, right? So the big other can be an institution, it can be a political party, but it can also be embodied in a particular individual, right? And so the idea is this. The hysteric says, oh, there's this other, and I want to be that object that completes that, fills that void, fills that lack. I can complete this other person, right? And so what you find in this fundamental fantasy, it tends to be more one of submission and objectification. So when you look at these fantasies, on the one hand, you have the one that's very active. I lack something. I'm going to get it. I want it. I'm pursuing it. On the other, you have, I'm like this object thing that if this other has, they're going to be complete. Well, that's a kind of passive, culturally standard type of feminine disposition, right? And again, what Lacan is doing, he's not doing anything normative. He's saying when people come in, this is the shit that I deal with. So he's just dealing with how society has shaped us. He's not saying it's right. He's just saying, here's the default shit that I have to put up with every day. And what you find is, you find women have always, think about it, trophy wives. Well, you don't hear about trophy husbands for the most part, right? It's this idea women have always in society been reduced and objectified. And so it's no wonder that this kind of patriarchal shit has even affected how they fantasize, what they think is going to make them happy or give them jouissance, and it's basically catering to the other, filling this gap in the other. You know, behind every great man, there's a great woman, right? It's like that type of shit. And so there's a sense in which you find that women always, why do women want to be pretty? And they go out of their way, their appearance, all of this stuff. It's to be this object that's going to somehow have this kind of plenitude to it, that's going to go into the subjective life of this subject and give them a potency, a power, a fulfillment they didn't have before. And so this plays itself out in very concrete ways. And just like with the other one, there's, disjunction, conjunction, greater than, less than. There's different ways, but this is kind of a default feminine fantasy. And you can see that because it's the woman reducing herself to objet or a set of traces or traits or whatever that this other wants and lacks, and she gets off on that. And right. I think on some level you can kind of fit these onto the graphs of sexuation that Lacan presents in Seminar 20. It might be kind of like a rough isomorphic relationship, but more or less, I think they kind of work. I don't know. I think Bruce Fink mentions this. And just to finish up this whole thing about the clinical structures, I think it's really important. And Fink does an amazing job at tackling them in his book on the clinical Lacan. That's the best I've found on him so far. So if you want more on the pervert and psychosis and what's involved, there's entire chapters devoted to them in there.
Yeah, I think it's important to just throw out there, even though we can't cover this right now, that for Lacan there is no sexual relationship. That means that the desire of the obsessional or the hysteric, this isn't actually the clinical text. This isn't obsessional and hysteric, but this is the structure of male desire, the structure of female desire, right? So this is actually
generally speaking, yeah, for the most part.
They mostly map onto each other, but that structure, there's no matching up of the desire. So it's not like, oh, women want to be an object and men want to have an object. How nice, it fits together. There is a sort of non-relationality that holds it together, but it's mediated in a way that it'll never actually be satisfying, or there will never actually be a relation of the thisness of the two.
Both of them, one is alienation, right? It's this guy thinking, oh, if I get this thing, I'm going to be complete. I'm going to have achieved it. No, you never achieve this. It never happens, right? So you're alienated in the sense that you think you can be something you can't be. On the other hand, the woman's alienated because she's objectifying herself and trying to make herself into what this other wants or what she thinks it lacks, right? Well, you're never going to fulfill this other's desire. It's never going to be complete. So both of them are full of shit. They're just full of shit in different ways. And it's incompatible. It doesn't work.
Right. And part of the reason is because initially in the child, before sexuation happens, there's the potential of being a subject and being an object, in the sense that both any human in the world is both subject and object. And you take the position of one or the other if you're going to follow the pattern of sexuation. Right. Like a primordial thing, but they're both true. So when you cut off the one part, you're cutting off part of a truth about yourself, so you can never be recognized as that truth, and you can never recognize another as that truth. Anyways,
and here's the thing: I think we can reword what you just said. I think sometimes the existential terminology helps, even though we're talking psychoanalysis. On some weird level, it's like the one fantasy is like, I'm pure transcendence, I'm pure subjectivity. There's this thing I lack, but me as a subject, I've got it in me to get whatever I want. It's like I can achieve anything, right? Whereas the other is like, I'm pure facticity. I'm this thing that this other needs, and they're both in bad faith, to talk like Sartre, or they're both inauthentic, right? Because one wants to reduce themselves to the object, one wants to reduce himself to the subject, which basically amounts, I'm all facticity or I'm all transcendence, and you're neither. You're both. I mean, you're neither all one or the other.
Yeah.
And so, of course, Lacan doesn't talk like that, but I mean, I see a certain, some of those existential concepts helping here.
It was Sartre's therapist, as we all know now. So,
and here's the thing, again, just to finish up. So one of the things that Lacan highlights about hysterics is they are very, very fixated on the other's desire. But what they mean here, and he even goes to Freud's case studies, and he shows this. Women are very, very fixated on what other women desire. Men are not so much fixated on what other men desire. If I see a woman I'm attracted to at a bar, I could give a shit if other guys think she's hot or pretty or attractive or whatever, or intelligent or whatever. If I'm attracted to her, I'm attracted to her. But to put it in simple terms, you don't see the boy band phenomena with men. It's a hysterical phenomenon, and Lacan emphasizes how women, generally speaking, or people with the hysterical structure, it could be biological men, but if you have this structure, you desire through the other very, very strongly. And so a guy could walk in a bar and maybe he's not that attractive or whatever, but if word goes around he's really successful or he's famous or whatever, you can watch this spread with the women. I've seen this happen where it spreads throughout the bar with women, and all of a sudden you got 5 girls who want this guy just because the other girl wants this guy. And this is part of the hysteric structure. And I think Bruce Fink does a good job of going into this. And so this is where, like, I always like the idea of writing a book called Lacan at the Bar.
yeah.
You should. Totally should.
And you could really use these situations you see in bars to go, there's obsessional neurosis, there's the pervert, there's hysteria, and give these really concrete examples of it and flesh it out that way.
See, I save women from their own neuroses and the societal implications by being undesirable in general.
You fit some other form of
But see, but what you don't get, that's in itself a form of confidence, which is very desirable to women. And so you might be torturing them more than you know.
Well, you're filtering away the people that are most hysterical, right? Like,
Because one thing that hysterics will do, one thing that they get off on, so you see in the fantasy, the bard other, a lot of the times women love nothing more than to point out the lack in a man. Oh, you're a man. You think you're so full and confident and complete. Oh, well, you can't do this. Or, oh, you don't have that much, as much money as you say you have. They love pointing this shit out. And they get off on pointing out the lack because the whole idea is on some basic social unconscious level. The patriarchy, all of this stuff has conditioned. Men have a sense of completeness and fullness and independence that women don't have. And even if it's becoming less and less true, those are still ghosts that affect us, that we still think through. I mean, the echoes of Disney movies and shit, right? They still are with us. And so you find this time and time again, and I'll be hanging out at the bar or whatever, and I'll see a woman kick into this mode, and she gets so much enjoyment from pointing out this guy's lack. But at the same time, there's something where she wants to point out the lack, she gets off on it, but she's also likes the idea of being that which can complete him or fulfill him. I've seen so many women who kick into this, like, it's her boyfriend, but she has this motherly relationship to him where if I cultivate him, I can really take this rock and turn it into a diamond, right? And so what Lacan is describing with these math themes, and the reason I just want to take the time to talk about that a little bit, they really do flesh out. And it's like with Saussure, right? This is this influence of Saussure. There's long, there's the structure of language, but then there's these very specific, concrete speech acts, parole. And what he's doing is he's setting up a kind of psychoanalytic long. These are the basic structures, but they're going to have all kinds of different incarnations in the parole of our subjectivity, of our intersubjective relationships.
Sweet.
What an awesome crash course on Lacan.
Well, here's the thing. So I've told you, I still sometimes have mixed. Like, I think we should start with Seminar 17. But what I have to just prepare you for is, if you saw the notes that I have on Seminar 17, it's insane. I think if I was to print it out, it'd be 400 pages. I mean, because you have to unpack these words and go through all the concepts. And so my approach to it is, even if we set it up for 12 lectures, right? And we say, okay, these are going to be long. They're going to be 2.5 hours or 3 hours. We might still have to do more to do this right. But I really do think that if we go through, we take the time to unpack these concepts, we keep going over them, we keep connecting them, because we haven't said anything much about repetition, about drive. There's so many other concepts going on, right? But we take our time with it, then we will have laid this fundamental foundational understanding of Lacan that will enable us to go to the other seminars and just focus on them. Because once we get the basic concepts down, then we don't have to do all this background concept building to be able to understand what he's doing, right? And so it is, I mean, I've probably spent more time unpacking these concepts than I have any other thinker, but for whatever my opinion count, I think it's worth it. I don't regret a minute that I spent working on Lacan. And seeing what Zizek does with him. So how much time do we have left? 20 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess and again, I wish I could have got more into Zizek here, but
you had to set up. You had to do the setup, and Brian's stepping into the bathroom really quick, and then I'm going to take a beer in here. Oh, you can hear? Okay.
Like I said, when we get back, we could do another section where we just go over chapter 1 in greater detail. But what I want to say is, when you read Zizek, if you go back over this chapter anytime soon, keep in mind, okay, say, all right, here's just like Tyler said, how to go read Phenomenology of Spirit. What I'll say is this: read a session, and then ask yourself, okay, what are the main points here, right? And then read the next section, and then ask yourself, how do they connect? How do we get from this section to this section? And you just keep building it, because 7 sections down the road, you're going to go, how in the fuck does this connect to section 1? Because there is a strong drift in what he does. It's I start off on the symptom. I end up on canned laughter. Then I'm going to talk about Kafka as a critic of Althusser, and it just keeps drifting. But there is a certain argumentative link throughout the whole chapter that, if you really work at it, you can see how they're connecting. And so what I'm going to try to do here is just kind of go over just a little bit of how this is going to work. So, Dave, did you say you need to use the bathroom before I go into this?
Yeah, well, I can listen while I do it too. So,
okay.
For it.
Okay, so the book starts off, at least this chapter, and all I want to say about the preface or the intro, whatever it is, what he says is, my main project for this book is to basically perform a threefold marriage. I want to marry Lacanian psychoanalysis with Marxism with Hegelianism. That's the main point of the book, is how do I take what's best in Lacan and Freud, Marx and Hegel, and wrap them all up into a coherent theory.
By literally rehabilitating or resuscitating each one with the other.
Right, exactly. It's a highly relational concept frame building, right? I'm going to read Lacan through Hegel and Marx. I'm going to do Marx through Hegel, Lacan, vice versa, blah, 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 blah. And so what he is going to do in this book, and why I think this book is one of his best, if not his very best, he's going to build a brand new theory of ideology. And so you could say that the best thinkers of ideology, or something like it, because like Gramsci uses hegemony is his key term, right? You could say there's even something like ideology in Foucault, even though it's different. He wants to talk about discourses of power and all that, right? Zizek wants to take what he's learned from Lacan specifically and say, okay, what does the Marxist tradition get wrong? How does it go wrong in thinking about ideology? And what can we use from Lacan to better understand relations of power, political manipulation, all these types of things? And so that's the trajectory of the book. Now, this first chapter primarily just involves Lacan, Freud, and Marx. I don't think there's a single mention of Hegel here. And I don't think he really gets into the Hegelian stuff until later in the book. Early on, I think it's primarily psychoanalysis and Marxism. But when he starts off, he begins with a chapter or a section. Okay, so the first chapter is called How Did Marx Invent the Symptom? Now, this is chapter 1 of part 1. Part 1 is just called The Symptom. And chapter 2 is going to be on the relationship between the symptom and the synthome, which the synthome is a concept the later Lacan developed. And just like in Lord of the Rings, they talk about one ring to rule them all. This is kind of what the synthome essentially ends up becoming. Is Lacan thinks that there's a fundamental symptom at the heart of all of us. And if you take that symptom away, we all, in a sense, would collapse subjectively. And this is something he later on would build. There's a whole later seminar devoted to the synthome, and he uses James Joyce in it a lot. But that's it when we ever get around to reading chapter 2. But in chapter 1, this is about how Marx invented the symptom. Now, again, you have to kind of take these headings that he uses with a grain of salt, because you're going to get into the middle of the chapter and the later part of the chapter, and it's like he doesn't even mention the symptom at all, right? It's like, how the hell did we get here? But it's there, even if he's not using the word symptom directly. There's a chain of development that he starts with the symptom, how the symptom was produced by Marx. And what he wants to do in this first chapter is say, look, there is a structural homology, a structural similarity between Marx's concept of the commodity and commodity fetishism and Freud's concept of the symptom. So Marx was able to get at some kind of fundamental structure or mechanism that preceded Freud developing it. And the idea is that something about the commodity that Marx understood is structurally homologous to the structure of the symptom. And again, for Freud, a symptom could be dreams, slips of the tongue, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the main one is going to be dreams, but also hysterical symptoms, meaning like where it's a bodily symptom. The symptom is embodied through some bodily tic or whatever. And so he starts off, he's going to say, according to Lacan, it was none other than Karl Marx who invented the symptom. So what is important here is he's going to show that the way that psychoanalysis interprets certain phenomena, because of this structural homology to the commodity form, to commodity, the structure of commodities, we can use psychoanalysis in a broader terrain. For Lacan, he always said time and time again, I am a psychoanalyst training others to be psychoanalysts. He intended his concepts to primarily be used in a clinical setting with an analyst engaging in psychoanalysis with an analysand. What Zizek is doing is saying, look, we can take these concepts that Lacan built and we can apply them to social and political phenomena. They're not just applicable to the individual patient. They have a social application. And so that is what he's doing here. In being able to show that commodities have the structure of symptoms, then you see that both Freud and Marx have a similar way of interpreting phenomena and since they're structurally homologous, you can use the one for the other. So this is a way of bringing Freud and Marx together, or ideology critique and psychoanalysis. And I mean, he says a lot here, and I mean, we don't have time to go into all of that now, but that's kind of the key thing going on here is mapping, making a kind of interpretive space where you're justified in using psychoanalysis on ideology and politics and so on. Oh no, go ahead.
So something repeated through the development of this comparison is his emphasis on the word form. So it's not so in the with the dream, there's the manifest content and then the latent thought, right? And then with the commodity, there's the how does that play out in the commodity?
So with the commodity, there's the price. You go to the store, you see, okay, this box of cereal costs $5, right? So that's what the manifest content is. What's hidden beneath that is how much labor went into the production of that. And so it's labor power, socially necessary labor time. And that's what's concealed, the latent content. But here's what's really important. And one of the things you really want to take away, and he goes out of his way here to point this out. Let me find it. Just passed it. Okay, so this is what he says is, okay, on page 7, he says, the crucial thing to note here is that we find exactly the same articulation in 2 stages with Marx in his analysis of the secret of the commodity form. Now, these 2 stages, here's the thing. One of the greatest insights that I think Zizek provides in this specific section is this. People think that Freudian dream interpretation works like this. Hey, here's the manifest dream content. Here's what I remember about the dream. Okay, let's interpret that and get to its latent meaning, to get to its latent content. That's how the secret of the dream. That's not true. There's 3 key aspects to the dream for Freud, and Zizek quotes Freud in support of this. So Freud himself says this, but most Freudians and most psychoanalysts just say there's manifest content, latent content, the end. Well, when you actually figure out what the latent content is, it's not anything revelatory at all. It's not a big deal. It's not anything that's somehow deeply it's not some deep revelation about this person's subjectivity. Here's the 3 keys, 3 main aspects to the dream. And you could say to the symptom in general. There's a manifest content, there's a latent content, and there's an unconscious desire. That unconscious desire, that's the real important thing that the psychoanalyst wants to look for. And what you find is this. The unconscious desire is in the form of the dream. It's in the mechanisms of displacement and condensation. So if you want to figure out what the unconscious desire is, you don't look at the latent content that the person can figure out through association. You want to ask, why did the latent content take on this specific form of manifest content? So the real secret of the dream, or the unconscious desire behind the dream, the real important aspect of it is in the form itself. It's why did the dream take this latent content and transform it into this manifest content via displacement and condensation?
Could you go a little bit into condensation? Displacement seems to be self-explanatory, but what's...
Exactly. So condensation is when you take a bunch of ideas and condense them into one image. So let's take, I should have examples of these ready, but...
It's like folding or crumpling a bunch of things into a sort of a dense image that has like, so when you condense a chicken bouillon, you boil the entire, like a lot of chicken down into like its essence or into like a small cube. So it's kind of just like a lot of different interpretations or things.
Okay, this is a silly example, but this will give you the point. Say your father is very much like a big guy, like he's bear-like, right? He resembles a bear, right? And your mother, she resembles a fox. She has a face that resembles a fox. Well, if you have a dream where there's the body of the bear but the face of a fox on the same creature, right? You've condensed your father and your mother. You put them into one image. That's condensation. And of course, here's the crazy thing about it. Even right now, see, I struggle to come up with a decent example of it. What you find, and again, this is something we'll definitely go into in greater detail when we get to the Lacan study. The unconscious is absolutely brilliant at this shit. It's smarter than we are. Our ego level consciousness can't do this shit nearly as good as the unconscious does. And it's precisely because the unconscious makes itself known through displacement, condensation. That's why the unconscious is structured like a language for Lacan, is that it expresses itself through these mechanisms of condensation and displacement. And those two mechanisms map onto metaphor and metonymy. They're linguistic mechanisms. And so this is why the psychoanalyst is able to figure out what's going on with the unconscious, because they're in a position to understand the kind of language. It's not a language in our everyday sense of the word, but it's a kind of language. And if you figure out how it works and, its little linguistic tricks, you're able to interpret it and follow it. And that's, again, why the unconscious is structured like a language. And it's absolutely brilliant. So, I've had dreams where I had no idea what they were about. And then I sit there and I do free association on them. I go, holy shit, this is that person and that person put together. And, it works. But yeah, that's the key thing, though, is whenever you think Freud and dreams, think the three, not just the two: manifest content, latent content, unconscious desire. And so what then he's going to do in the next section, it's called the unconscious of the commodity form. So we know what the form of the dream is. It's condensation and displacement. I never feel like any of these Marxists do that great of a exegesis on the form of the commodity. But in a sense, it's similar kind of thing, right? It's this one thing's disguised for another because, and what he's going to do in this next section is something really interesting, but he's going to do it via the work of Son Rethel, if I'm pronouncing his name right. He wrote this famous book called Intellectual and Manual Labor, or Manual and Intellectual, one or the other. I think it's Intellectual Manual Labor. And so he's a Marxist, and what he's going to do is say, look, our very structure of thought, right, especially, and he's going to take thought from a Kantian perspective for the most part, and Zizek is especially going to Kantianize it. But the idea is that our apparatus of a priori concepts, causality, substance, so on and so forth, is actually rooted in commodity exchange. That the way we think, our very fundamental categories are fundamentally rooted in commodity exchange. And Son Rethel wrote a whole book about this where he goes through and lays this out. And Zizek basically just quotes him and appeals to him. Now, a lot of people could say, well, I have deep doubts about this. It's a theory of epistemology. It's the idea that what we take for knowledge is ultimately rooted in our material economic circumstances. It's a very Marxian type of theory of epistemology. I don't know if I'm satisfied with it. I from what I've heard about it, my suspicions are raised, even as much as I like Marx. But Zizek takes it as kind of a given. He accepts it, and he's going to show how the unconscious of thought, what we take thought to be, is actually something radically other to itself. And for Zizek, he thinks that for theoretical consciousness, with its ideas of substance, causality, all these things, to realize that it was fundamentally rooted in something as contingent and banal as commodity exchange is a terrifying thought for it. And it mirrors like what we were saying earlier, when we discover that our subjectivity is based on these stupid contingent accidents. So this is a very kind of Lacanian twist he's putting on it. So he's going to talk about the commodity. He's going to talk about its relation to Freud's idea of the symptom. He's going to take the commodity and show how its fundamental form or structure shapes and forms the very categories of our thought and knowledge, what we take knowledge to be. And that's going to be the main point of this second section. Then he's going to launch into a great discussion of the social symptom. Wait, does that social symptom come next? Or yeah, we go from the unconscious of the commodity form. And again, the unconscious of the commodity form. That heading translates into the structure of the commodity is the unconscious of thought itself, meaning it is the structure of what thought takes itself to be. Like thought thinks, oh, I'm the one who is just a priori has causality, substance, and all the various Kantian categories, when in fact they're all derived from commodity exchange. And then he's going to go into this whole discussion of the social symptom. And what's important about that? Well, again, many psychoanalysts say that this Lacanian stuff is only applicable in the clinical setting with the individual person and the individual symptom. Zizek's going to expand it, talk about the social symptom, that there's social symptoms, and for him, he defines it like this. Go down, he gives a definition of the symptom, and he talks about it in other ways, but let's see. The symptom is, strictly speaking, a particular element which subverts its own universal foundation, a species subverting its own genus. So what this social symptom is, in concrete terms is going to be, it's going to be some aspect of society that society produces that actually undermines society itself. Society gives rise to its own deadlock. It produces something out of its own logic that serves to undermine it. Well, in a sense, this is what a hysterical symptom does, right? It makes life unbearable for somebody, and yet that symptom comes from the very core of that person's subjectivity, right? It's like this weird undecidable. On the one hand, it's totally internal because it comes from the fundamental aspect of your subjectivity. On the other hand, it intrudes into your life and it's something exterior, right? This is something Lacan's going to return to time and time again, and he uses his neologism extimacy, that the most intimate part of ourselves is something deeply external and foreign. This is a recurring theme in his work. And so for Marx, he's able to take, okay, let's take this idea of the hysterical symptom, see how it works in the clinic, and what you find is at the social level, a la Marx, what's the symptom of capitalism, or at least industrial capitalism? The proletariat. The very logic of capitalism creates the proletariat, and yet, from the standard traditional Marxist perspective, it's precisely this type of social unit that capitalism's logic gives rise to that is its undoing. It's what gets in its way, it's what blocks it, it's what problematizes it, throws a monkey wrench into the system. And yet it comes from the very center of the system itself. You don't have capitalism without wage labor. At least not, maybe capitalism will morph into something unimaginable, but especially industrial capitalism, that relies on wage labor. So you got to have the wage laborer, and yet the wage laborer is precisely what stands to undermine the system. And so part of what ideology critique would involve would be locating these points at which there's points of tension, unraveling, problematization that are internal to it. Just in this you see the Hegelian echo in Marx, where Hegel was going to say, look, we start with sense certainty. We think that it's consistent with itself, but it actually gives rise to its own undoing, because when we say this or that, We're actually using the most universal, generic terms we possibly could. So we think we're designating individuality. We're not. We're designating actually the most universal of things. So we got to move on because we hit this deadlock. Well, this is something that inspired Marx, and he thinks that this doesn't just happen at the highest levels of abstract thought, like with Hegel. This happens concretely in our material conditions, and capitalism in its materiality gives rise to the proletariat, and the proletariat's the revolutionary agent that's going to overthrow capitalism and bring forth socialism. And so the question is, when you're doing ideology critique, one way to approach it is going to be, where is there this weird internal, external point that comes from the very fundamental logic of the system, but is by necessity its own undoing? Right. So, I mean, that kind of gives you a little bit to go on. I mean, just to finish up, I'm skipping ahead. If you want me to tell you where I think there are really great highlights in this chapter, I really love what he says about cynical ideology, that now more and more, I mean, I guess if I want to stand back and not even talk about the sections directly, here's what I like about this chapter. One, he says, look, it's precisely when we think we're non-ideological that we're at our most ideological, because ideology is not something that really resides at the level of thought. It's really in what we do. And this is where he uses Pascal to, develop a theory of ideology. And I mean, this is something, despite his criticism of Althusser, he's inspired through Althusser, because he's the one who talked about Pascal in relation to ideology. So the idea is this: the classical Marxist interpretation is there's ideology, and it's this bogus conceptual framework that we see things through. We have bad ideas that warp our experience, and if we could just get rid of those bad ideas, we'd see things as they really are. For Zizek, that's not how ideology really works at all, because it puts ideology at the level of thought. What ideology really is what we do. Our default behavioral and unconscious fantasies. And so we can say, oh, we're not ideological. I think politics is bullshit. I think the system is bullshit. And yet at the same time, I still do what a consumer does. And, this is why I believe it's Plague of Fantasies, he gives this wonderful example of the three toilets, that you go to England, you go to Germany, and you go to France. And I mean, England and America, right? You go to England and America, Germany and France. All three have different toilet designs. And for him, even though we supposedly live in this post-ideological age where we're all basically the same, we're not, because we produce these different toilet designs, and when you see how they work, you go, oh, see, they embody these fundamental presuppositions about how things should work in ways that are different. And so Zizek shows that architecture, it's funny, I guess, put toilet design in the sphere of architecture, but how we design things reflects our fundamental presuppositions. And so, as he likes to put it, when you go to the bathroom, you're still knee-deep in ideological shit. And, yeah.
I have a question, but I have to write this thing over. Okay. So, if ideology, this is something that was tripping me up. If ideology is kind of what, if it operates not on the level of thought, but on the level of not action, but behavior, right? This sort of autonomous body of habit, or, you're saying, I think this whole thing is bullshit, and I can consume ironically, but I still consume, right? If that's true, then I guess I'm curious about the possibility of, so because Zizek said this thing, and I don't remember the page number, but where, how does this connect to belief? Because he says that, like, he's quoting Kierkegaard about how it's a blasphemy to believe in Christ because he's wise and good and you have all your reasons and you've thought about it. Mm-hmm. The thing is you have to believe first, and then from that you understand the reasons. And so the that first belief is wholly arbitrary. You're taking a leap into it. And so I guess what I'm asking is if like engaging in these sorts of behaviors for reasons that aren't just justifying the pre-existing behavior. Let's say, you try to stop consuming and behaving in this way, and so you discover the sort of like, I guess like necessity of doing so, and so you choose to do it because you want to stay alive or something like that. Does that take it out of the realm of ideology when you have not just an awareness that things are bullshit, that the story itself is bullshit, and you're still acting in that way, but when you're aware of, I guess, the sort of compulsions to act, or I don't know. See, it's getting hard to articulate, because to me, I see a difference in someone who is aware that the system's bullshit and still consuming versus someone who has tried not to consume and is like actively I don't know how to say this, but aware that whenever they're doing what they're doing, they're not just doing it, they're like being forced to do it. It's really hard for me to like get this out, but I guess I could, because I can see a lot of like, I knew students who, they'll sit there and like eat pizza in class and then like throw off something about like consumerism and revolution or whatever, but they're very like cynical and flippant about it. And I was just like, it felt so blind. I was like, can you not see that what the hell? Like, you're still doing this thing,
Way that I would like to bring a Starbucks cup to DSA meetings.
Yeah, but it feels different to me to be like, at the end of, trying not to do that, and then seeing how like it's absolutely impossible for you to live your life without it. And so then instead of giving up and just submitting to the ideology, you like choose your specific actions. And because if that makes belief not really belief, can you pick up what I'm trying to do here?
So here's the idea for him, and I guess this is we'll go to the core of what he's saying. For him, we have to always have some frame through which we structure our behavior and our relations to others. So for him, ideology is not on the side of thought, right? In this detached reflective space, or this ideal, meaning mentally interior space of thought. Ideology is reality itself for him. What he means is ideology structures our physical material behavior. It is what is shaping our very material behavior. And in that sense, it's on the side of reality. So for him, ideology is a type of fantasy. This is where he's going to marry ideology to Lacanian fantasy. And just like there's those structural fantasies that we've gone over, they're in some way going to be tied to the big other, which is our symbolic order, which is going to involve what we call ideology. And so the idea is that if we were to lose ideology entirely, we would lose our very sense of reality, what the world is, right? In a sense, we would lose our being in the world, because it's this unconscious ideology, the ideology at the level of fantasy, that actually orientates us in the world. It gives us a position from which to comport ourselves to things and others. And I mean, since we all love Heidegger here, it's as if ideology is our fundamental mode of disclosure, right? Like, just like Heidegger says that you're going to disclose from a certain horizon. You're going to disclose, in Nietzschean terms, from a certain perspective. It's the same thing with ideology. That ideology is this frame through which, or this horizon, this certain background presuppositional framework through which we get any grasp on the world at all. And so this is why having your ideology, if it does collapse in the very heart of your subjectivity, it's world shattering, right? Because you've lost this frame through which you organize yourself and your relations to others and what you expect and what you desire and all of this type of thing. Ideology goes much deeper than just, oh, I have, so, the classic idea. So the capitalists want me as wage laborer to view myself as I am a free autonomous subject in the market who has the freedom and right to buy what I want, sell what I want, choose what I want. I'm free. Woohoo. Right? When in fact, I am structurally paralyzed. I either choose to sell my wage labor to the capitalists or I go into poverty. And more, you can sell your wage labor to the capitalists and still be in poverty. But you're not really free, right? And so the idea in classical Marxism is that you have these bad ideas and the capitalists want those bad ideas to be how you see yourself and how you view things. They want you to view these things through those bad ideas because it's a form of control. But that's if it was just that simple, oh, I have mistaken ideas, we could correct those. When you realize that ideology goes to the very level of our deepest desire, our deepest fantasies, it has a much, much stronger hold on us, what we want from life, how we desire, what we expect, than just bad ideas would have. And so that's what he's getting at here, is that ideology is far more powerful and far deeper precisely because it primarily resides at the unconscious level. And so this is why he likes Pascal so much. Pascal famously says, and he quotes the long quote, if you're not a Christian and you want to be a Christian, then don't sit there and try to reason your way to it via thought. Just mimic Christians. Just start doing what they do and make it a bodily habit. Put it in the default level of your very behavior. And what you do find is that tends to get people believing. If they, you've put yourself in a behavioral pattern, it affects what you believe at the level of thought. And that's what he's going to get at is, okay, ideology is not just bad ideas at the conscious level. It's unconscious fantasy that shapes our very sense of who we are in the world and what we want. On top of that, it has a deep relationship to jouissance. We get ideological enjoyment we get jouissance from ideology. It is something that we actually get jouissance from, or pleasure, enjoyment in general. And so the very fact that it's not just an idea, but it's something that we find ways to enjoy. He uses the neologism jouissance, right? Jouissance in language, jouissance in sense. So he's combining jouissance and sense in jouissance. And so it's this idea that the symbolic order does give us some sort of enjoyment, some sort of jouissance, because, life without any type of Dossmann or Big Other would be a nightmare. We wouldn't be able to get a grasp on anything. So we are invested in our symbolic networks and symbolic orders precisely because they allow us to get some grip on the real.
Right. So I understand that, and I guess I'm just kind of being neurotic about, and this is what in the Lacan class I took with GBT, not with you, the other one. It just would drive me absolutely crazy, this question, because it was like, okay, but how do we fucking change that? Because to me, even though there is some level of satisfaction in this current ideology or in this current system of relations, I just see, and that's an entrapment of it, is that there is this, it's not just preying on, but satisfying some fundamental desires humans have.
Mm-hmm.
How the fuck do you change things in the sense of because Zizek uses the example of the Marxists who kind of act like the Christians. Just accept this, and just do this and this and that, and you'll become, what is there to lose? You'll become a good person. It doesn't matter if there's a lot of reason for it. And so without doing that, is there a way? Is it analysis? I guess where you have to change people's fundamental desires, or Is
I
there?
think what he would say is part of it is simply putting yourself in a position to do new things. So I think he would say that, I mean, now I'm going to put words in his mouth, but part of the problems in America is we have so little opportunity for worker unity. There's no Marxist learning centers. There's no working class centers where people can go and organize, right? And I think we would see a shift in ideology in this country if people could actually do what Marxists used to do. And this, he emphasizes this. I don't think he'll ever just give us a clear answer on how to break our ideological frame and get a new one. This is why he likes Fight Club. And as unsatisfying as it may be, it gives us something to go on. He says, look, you have to do what the narrator does. You have to beat the shit out of yourself. And that involves basic introspection and trying to change things and trying to learn new things and doing your best. Like, there's no quick fix because these ideologies have taken hold in us at such an early age, right? That it's going to be hard, and maybe we won't ever fully get outside of that framework. But I think what he's offering us here is this idea that part of what getting a new ideology would be doing something new, just like Christians. When I was I was raised Christian fundamentalist, as I told you, you would see this, that the people who got saved and ended up living a Christian lifestyle, they didn't get saved the first day. They just started coming to church and they started doing what everybody else does. And after a while, then they'd want to get saved. But there's this whole kind of behavioral modification that takes place first. And I think he would probably say the same thing with us. And despite his differences and disagreements with Deleuze, I mean, if you take what he's saying seriously about this whole idea of put yourself in, start doing different things, that's very Deleuzian to me, right? That it's at the level of deterritorialization of the body, that you take on different bodily movements and reactions and all of this type of thing, that there's a change that's produced.
Yeah.
And maybe Deleuze would say, yeah, but he's talking about the unconscious, which is some kind of thought, and that's too ideal for me or too mental, because we know Deleuze is big on the body. It's not that he rejects the thought entirely. It's just that I think Deleuze is all about the mechanics of the body in learning and in changing yourself. But there's something similar there.
Okay.
I think it's also notable Zizek's own political philosophy gets a little, frankly, I'd call it unrealistic currently, in that he essentially says, like, we need to combat the neoliberal ideology because it is the dominant ideology. So I think his solution, at least at the current moment, is essentially to create some sort of ideological black hole where we essentially not ally with the fascists, but basically encourage this ideological uprising where we destroy a common societal ideological notion and therein attempt to replace it with the Marxist notion. And I might be reading what he's saying wrong in some ways, but
no, I think you're right there. I think he doesn't like this is why he said he would have voted for Trump over Hillary Clinton. It's not that he supports Trump at all. It's that he thinks that this ideological consensus, this compromise between like Democrats and Republicans, they're all neoliberals, right? And they use the whatever marginal differences they have as a way to form this two-party system. But for him, it's the center that is the great ideological threat, because I like what you said about the black hole. In some sense, the center itself is a kind of black hole. It sucks all alternatives into itself and collapses any type of ideological differences. It's like, okay, everybody's compromised. We've made all the compromises we can make. All right, that's the best we can do. And if you're a Marxist, you're just going to go, no, it's not good enough. We have to try for something better. And so what we saw with this upsurge with the alt-right, where there was this radical resentment and challenge to the center. I mean, as a Marxist, he likes it because it's precisely that. It's a challenge of the center. And I think he's like, you know, it's what you said. He thinks that the question is, how can the left harness that or develop that further for its own purposes? And as he's stated many a times, the left hasn't figured it out yet.
I think Zizek's essential failure in his thinking, though, is that he assumes we're going to win. And I don't think we can make that assumption yet.
We just gotta cut. We gotta cut this.
We gotta cut.
Oh.
Because we're at that point where let's just talk all night. But
yeah.
I'm sure.
I tell you what, if you get a chance to go back over it, the one section that I really, really love, it's my favorite here, and I think it's honestly the easiest one to read. It's where he talks about. Let me make sure I got the right section here.
While you find it, I'm just going to say that I think that we'll use this as a we can send this to people who aren't a part of this conversation, who will be a part of the Lacan thing in the fall, as a hey, you missed the first thing already, watch it, right? Yeah. And then so you can kind of plan on this being the basis upon which to, so you don't have to say it again, right? Like. Yeah. This should be common understanding what's been said here. And then any kind of questions that come from us all having conversations now and thinking over the next few months will get addressed in the next video, right? So,
and like I said, with the Lacan stuff, part of it is we just have to repeat different things. So we said some stuff about jouissance, but there's other stuff to say, and we got to connect it to those. And that's what I'll try to do throughout this whole series is we'll discuss Seminar 17, but we'll also use this as an opportunity to do an introduction to Lacan and kind of take two birds with one stone. If you get a chance to read any section in this chapter again, check out Fantasy as a Support of Reality. I think this is one of the best things he's ever written. And this is where he talks about, he gives you this great example of how a German in the 30s encountered their Jewish neighbor. And what ideology does is you experience the Jewish neighbor. The Jewish neighbor is incredibly friendly and kind. And what ideology does is immediately turn that into a counter argument against itself. Ideology turns, how did I put it? Ideology turns disconfirmation data into confirmation data. That's one of Zizek's great insights. And he says, ideology puts the spin on it. It says to the German, see, those Jews are so tricky. They're great at hiding their true nature behind this appearance of kindness and neighborliness. I told you they're not to be trusted, right? So ideology can put any spin on anything it wants in service to itself, to justify itself.
I wanted to say really quickly, just in relation to Zizek's current political position, just because this really helped me understand a few things, at least. Maybe not about why he chose to say what he did, but when he's talking about cynical reason, right? When he's talking about Sloterdijk, and then he's saying how cynical reason changes what the approach. It almost seems like he's saying because of cynical reason, the left can't answer in the same way as we would have, like with a traditional critique of ideology. You can't just read the ideological text with symptomatic reading and confront it with its blank spots. I'll just keep reading. With what it must repress to organize itself to preserve its consistency. Cynical reason takes this distance into account in advance. What that made me think of is how it doesn't work anymore to just call someone a racist, because it's like, yes, I am a racist, or it doesn't work anymore to say you're a sexist. It's like, yes, I am. I'm intentionally, like there's a sense of irony in a lot of, the white nationalists and other sorts of movements where they don't take the ruling ideology seriously, but they also just don't care if you confront them with the gap, because it's like, who knows what's irony and what's real? And they're not, like, you can't just say, oh, well, do you see how this social reality disprivileges these people or hurts these people, and they're just kind of like, haha, whatever. Like, I don't take this really ideology seriously, but I kind of do. And it's like
they're like, oh, I can find some facts that say otherwise.
But here's the thing, and he kind of deals with this a little bit later.
Why did we have to make mean Nazis?
What?
He deals with this a little bit later. So what he would say to these people, if somebody's like, yeah, I'm a sexist, I think women suck, or women are subservient to men, or I'm a racist, I think black people are inferior to white people. The Zizekian trick, a la Lacan, would be, okay, let's take it all the way here. Let's say black people are inferior to white people in some ways. Let's say women are suck in some ways. Your belief is still sick. Your belief is still pathological, even if some of this shit you're saying is true. That's what he deals when somebody, if a German was like, well, the Jews are financially exploiting, the Germans. Zizek goes, well, they were rich. They were capitalists. I hope some of them were. That's to be expected. They were capitalists. Of course they were exploiting some Germans. And the Jews were seducing our young girls. Well, yeah, some of them were seducing your young girls. Okay, that's true. You're still sick. Your belief is still fucked up, even if something you're saying is true in some way, shape, or form. Think of it like black people are not perfect. You can point out something imperfect. You can point out something imperfect about women. No one's perfect. That's not even what's relevant, though, in the case of a racist or a sexist, is what the actual reality of the other person. The very fact that they feel like they have to attack this other person so vehemently, there's something else going on, and the problem is with them. So regardless or not of whether this person, these other people are inferior or these other people have moral problems or whatever, that's not even relevant. What's relevant is the type of belief. And he uses Lacan's famous example of the pathologically jealous husband. Okay, what if his wife actually is cheating on him? What if she's sleeping around? His jealousy is still pathological nonetheless. And that's what we do with these type of people, is to say, okay, women aren't perfect. These other races aren't perfect. That's not the issue. That's not the problem. The problem is what's going on with your belief. That's where the problem lies, not with them, because it's not even about them. Just because you can quote, oh, these people do this and that's bad, or I don't like this, or what. That's not, everybody's imperfect. That's not even the issue. And so that's what Zizek does with them. And he thinks it's important to say, okay, let's take them at their word. Let's say, okay, this race is inferior, or this race does this, or this race. Okay, even if that's the case, you're still fucked up.
Yeah, that's actually
in the corner that way.
Not just in the psychoanalysis, but in psychology, that's been a proven effective technique. Like, for example, in intervening with like an abusive person, and who will use the action of the other person they're abusing as a justification. It's like, okay, well, they did all that. It doesn't matter. Why are you doing this, though?
Right, exactly. And you point out, yes, you're true. That objective, what you're talking about is true. Your belief is still a lie.
Yeah.
That's where
and political commentators were able to actually do that. And instead of hearing Trump say Mexicans were rapists, were actually, thought like that.
And they were like, oh, maybe some of them are. But anyways, here's what your problem is.
In the meantime, you're a fucking idiot.
Yeah. That's the good example. What? I mean, is there not...
And say, so what?
I think Nixon honestly just poisoned our media to this point where they just assume, because the checkerboard speech is like the ultimate, and I'll never say what you want, and I'll never give you any of the ground you want. And so now they don't know how to actually deal with people who give them the ground they want to call them racist. So I have to disprove you, and then I have to find the kernel of truth in your argument without analyzing the fucking form.
Yeah. It's like I have to give a platform to someone, and we have to talk about why we have to argue about whether black people are truly human. It's like, that shouldn't be what you're arguing about. You should be arguing about why they're even like doing the things they're doing, and like because it's very insulting to even put that to an argument.
Or
You know?
Arguing how to deal with the facts of reality that we find ourselves thrown into.
I just think there is a power though in that, saying, okay, we grant your reality even if it is true, and even if everything you said is true, which it's not, it's total bullshit. But even if it is true, you're still wrong in your belief, and here's why. Because it's not even about them. It's about this. Zizek's going to point out time and time again what it's really about is the people who are racist, the people who are sexist. There's some symbolic deadlock in their lives. There's something they can't work through, and instead of being able to cope with that, they have to put it on the other. It's the scapegoat mechanism, and that's the fundamental flaw. So the other person's not even relevant. Their inferiority or their immorality or whatever. The problem is something going. I love what Tupac said once, right? He said, it's not even about me. It's about some nightmare these people are having. He fucking nailed it, right? He's the scapegoat. Blame Pac. Blame the thuggish black guy. He's the problem. When in fact, it's about some nightmare they're having. It's not even really about him at all. And so I think that is a powerful insight that we can use from him, which is, all right, grant them the truth. Let them have their little moment. Oh, see, you agree. Not really. No. But let's say you're right. Okay, you're still wrong, even if you're right. And so once you do that, though, I mean, where do they go from there? I mean, if the whole thing is about them trying to prove something about women or whatever, you grant it, then okay. The real problem is, why are you fixated on them? What's the issue? Like, there's an unhealthy pathological fixation here, and if that's what's going on.
Yeah.
So right. So it's making you constantly cherry pick certain negative behaviors for certain groups and stitch that into something, and so that's like there are the two acts, right? The fixating on something, but then also like the constant evading something else, right? And so what are these things here? Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
What is that structure of the unconscious is making that latent stuff manifest in a certain way, right? Like it's that structuring.
Exactly. And that's exactly right. What is this fixating? This fixation is serving as a distraction. What is this distracting you from about yourself?
Yeah.
You know? Well, this has been awesome, guys. Like I say, I wish I could have gotten more into Sublime Object for you, but maybe even before we start Lacan, if we get a chance next month or something, we can talk about this first chapter in greater detail.
Well, we have read it now, so
I could even read it again before then.
I'm sure it'd be helpful after this conversation.
Yeah. Agreed.
Okay, that could be really cool. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. Glad we're doing this.
Yeah, have a good rest of your night.
All right, you too. Take care. Later.